Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us here on Eating Wild Honey and Locusts. I'm Jessica Knott, co-founder of EWHAL, and here is my co-host, Stacey Hubbard. Welcome, Stacey.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice to be here again with you.
It's always a pleasure to work with you. Stacey heads up the deliverance aspect of the ministry here at EWHAL and actually for Seth. And so that's a very big, thriving part of the ministry, along with Rainey Grosset, who leads the Prayer Furnace group for us. So it's always wonderful to be bringing these broadcasts together and all the different ministry that we bring. It's lovely to see Lars Weldon here today, Texas Jellybean, Will Banneter, Maria Doyle, Peggy Burke, David, Speaking the Truth, Tony Wright, all the way from the UK. We are based in the United Kingdom, but we broadcast through all of the Americas, Europe, Australasia, South Africa, and Uganda, places like that, where we have congregation, where we have fellowship. And it's lovely to see you. Tammy, it's been a long time. Lovely to see you here. Welcome. And all the others as you join through. I do want to say that I've got a notification that if we are on Facebook, unless you are a friend and I privatized my profile, you won't be able to post there. I haven't blocked you. I've just had to change the settings there. So it's always good to subscribe on the YouTube channel. Press the bell for all notifications. Facebook is just getting more and more difficult to stream and broadcast on. So we're using YouTube as the main channel. And then, of course, we have the same presence on our EWHAL EPG program guide. So you can always come there. Lynn from South Africa, wonderful to see you. Ingrid and Terry, wonderful that you're joining. And Fred, you're joining in live. How fantastic. Thank you. So we have Gary in the studio and we're going to bring him very, very shortly. Excited to have him back. It feels like a very much prolonged time, but actually it's just a month. And, it's the summer vacation. So he's doing it once every month until we resume back into an autumn type of program where it's once every 2 weeks, so we can go through his book. So I just have a little bit of housekeeping, Stacey, and then I want to go into the introduction, laying the foundation for Gary to come into. So we have Sukkot, based in Florida, Orlando, Devonport. We're returning back to Champions Gate this year. It is from the 5th to the 15th of October. Now, we've got a few places left. Really, it's about 4. So it's 2 double rooms. So it's either single sharing or it's for families. And that's all that we have into the 2 properties. And then it will be about 60 of us gathering together for Sukkot in 2 houses. One house will be for the main speaking and presentations and filming. The other house will be for the meals and the fellowship, so that there's no noise of preparation and so on. They're huge, luxurious, spacious properties. And this is the best way to facilitate it this year. And they're just next door to one another, actually across the road from one another. So it's like last year, just walking and in the morning to have breakfast together, etc. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. Now, we have only until the 15th of August reserved a 3rd house. If you don't come in and show your interest and make your reservations, by then we are relinquishing that 3rd house. We put a deposit on so that we can get that refunded back. We are a small ministry. We're not in a situation that we can provide these costs free of charge to everybody. There is a cost, and scripturally it says to, for the year ahead, to store and reserve this and set it aside for such a time as this. And so I really ask you to do that. But look, you've got a few days, and if there are people still wanting to come, more than demand, we have for a few days the option of a 3rd property available. After that, it's going to be on a basis of what is available and day attendance. Let's go, the program is really shaping up now, and it's going to be a beautiful time of fellowship. It is the best way that you get to meet people rather than seeing one another in a Zoom room for years. So we're now providing the opportunity at least once a year to twice a year with the feast, where we can come together and meet in person, build relationships, study together, worship together, and just have fellowship. So, it's very, very important. Welcome to Tim Galloy and Tony Lashley. Wonderful to have you here today. And Beatrice, as you join in. So fantastic that you're all joining. And to all of those who join in specifically for Gary, you are very welcome on this platform. The other thing to notify you of is that November the 16th, which is a Sunday, is going to be where we are having the launch of the Sefer Scriptures in a UK museum based in Lutterworth, England, Leicestershire. So that's going to be very, very special. It's obviously very, very momentous because it's a UK museum. And there afterwards, to celebrate it, we're going across to the town hall where I've hosted several meetings over the past years, which is actually going to be a candlelight orchestra. So, come November, it's dark anyway, so you can imagine the atmosphere. Now, this orchestral company, they move around all of the UK, predominantly different churches and so on, and doing concerts. And so they're coming specifically for our occasion to mark it, one for the local community and for our own communities coming together. So I would love you to come together. Just email me, jessica@ewhal.co.uk, especially for those in Europe and the UK, to come together so that we can celebrate this momentous occasion. But also the day before, on the 15th, EWHAL has acquired a building. We're going to utilize the same timing to have a blessing and a prayer, blessing and a time of gathering together for that meeting. We have people from Holland coming over and Ireland so far for both these events, and you are very warmly invited. So please just contact me, and details should be up very shortly on the website, but don't let that put you off until we get those details put on there. Okay, now I want to dedicate the rest of this time to going into the Genesis 6 conspiracy. We have the privilege of working since, I think, the beginning of this year with Gary Wayne, the author of books 1 and 2, and he's got book 3 underway. I'm not sure he can tell us how far in the progression that is taking place. But we're kicking off with chapter 21, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, straight away, this character, very hard to pronounce. So when Gary comes on, he can correct my pronunciation. But it's Utnapishtim, I believe. Now, he is a notorious character, and he's the opposite to Noah in every way that you can understand. Scholars promoted him as being one who was selected and entrusted to repopulate the earth in righteousness through his Shetith offspring. That's spelled Sethite. Now, Gary will bring context as to what that means, where that derives from. What I can tell you from reading Gary's book is he was an oppressive, evil ruler like Gilgamesh. In the chapter, you will discover and you will hear from Gary that the Macedonian flood, that narrative is in addition to what we know scripturally about the flood narrative. And what you see is that there are similar legends that are marked in mythology regarding the future generations and marking to the future generations about the survival story from the deluge concerning the Nephilim. So there's commonalities that are in place there. Now, there is a text called the Sumerian Lamentation text. And again, it's referring to the deluge. And there is a statement, ... the flood storm which overwhelmed the living creatures of heaven and earth, the black-haired ones. So basically what you derive from that statement is that the Nephilims lived with mortal humans in an antediluvian time, noting that the deluge overwhelmed both the human and the beings fathered by the heavenly realm. So just as important, it stresses that this blackheads were the intermingled race of the antediluvian Sumerians who were corrupted by the Nephilims, and part of the originating races of day 6 governed by the Canaanites. So much there that I'm looking forward to Gary to expound on, but I just wanted to highlight points that stick out in this book, and then Gary, being the author, he'll know what to expound on and focus on. So this is where the book of Enoch comes into context, connecting the Babylonian flood to Genesis. There's the character, Mahway, Mahway. He is a Nephilim son of the fallen angel Barakal. Now, this character received nightmares about the coming deluge and asked Enoch to interpret his dreams, from which Mahway learned that there was nothing that he could gain, nothing he could do to prevent the deluge from taking place, their own destruction. The narrative then moves on, naming one of the giants present at the gathering as Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is also listed as a giant in the Enoch books of giants. So therefore, you see so much more amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls and the fragments. Again, Gary will expound on this. And he does stress that the Anunnaki Nephilim was recorded in biblical sources as one of the giants intimately involved with the knowledge of the coming deluge. Then it would say that Gilgamesh recanted about the flood narrative renowned as the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's one and the same thing. I think that's what that's saying there. But I find these factors very, very fascinating. Then you move on to chapter 22, more tongue twisters, Deucallion, Manu, and Seth. These are the characters that are mentioned specifically in this chapter. So we have the Sapatha Brahmana. It is the earliest surviving account of antediluvian character king. He's a leader known as Manu. Now, Manu is remembered as the father of humankind and a member of the surviving brotherhood of the Seven Sages. I believe we went into the Seven Sages in the previous program we did with Gary. Now, Manu is a title that was held by 6 previous kings who reigned for a very long periods of time before the flood. And Manu permitted the 7 sages to accompany him on the ark. This is interesting, on the ark, where the flood waters and the deluge of the antediluvian world. So they went through their own flood and ark experience. The god Vishnu warned Manu of the impending catastrophe that would take place for 3 antediluvian worlds, but also said not to fear. In this account, Vishnu would provide Manu with an ark to escape upon. The question that Gary poses here is whether these 3 empires of Sumer, Atlantis, and Mu, what are they? Where does this go? And what he's saying is, where are these giants and these humans? Where were they provided an escape upon arks in all antediluvian civilizations of the earth? So where and how do these account for? So I'm very excited to get a chronology and more context to this and explanation. So Manu had a commission after the flood. He was to re-establish agriculture. He did that by utilizing the seeds he had stored away on the ark he escaped on. Again, this is very, very similar to the agriculture, the vegetation of Noah. Manu was both a king, but also an antediluvian patriarch, a founder, a dynasty of kings in that period, post-diluvian period. His ark was located in the Himalayan mountains range, and the survivors, once they were confident that all was well, they descended down, knowing that they wouldn't be washed away anymore. Very, very similar to the account of Noah. His reward for saving mankind, all the animals, all the plant life, was mastery over knowledge, insights into the mastery of the soul, a form of immortality, which again is echoed in all of the Sumerian accounts. So much there to get divulged. It's going to be a very hefty program. That's only just 2 chapters. You go into chapter 3. Hopefully, Gary will be able to go into these all the way up to chapter 25, I believe, today. The Rephaites and the Amorites. So this is to do with bloodlines and covenants. And really, Gary will be bringing an explanation of a definition of who the Emites or the Emin are. They are giant aborigines who occupied the land east of the Jorden River and who were disposed by the Moabites. The name Emin, E-M-I-N, was derived from the fear they inspired because of their sinfulness and their size. They were defined as noisemakers because of their thunderous bellows of their voices that the Antediluvians and the Titans were well known for. And though they mumbled and they murmured, and the Amorites destroyed them, but this is a well-known characteristic of them. And they're also known for their talents that these giants had in war. For in one account, they were considered masters of war, but they're also the Avites and the Avim. These are other characters Avvites or Avim. They were described as wicked giants who dwelled amongst the Philistines in Gaza. So it's nice because you're getting to see the biblical context here and structure and land identified with the Hivites. So there's so much here. And Gary moves into the Rephaites and explains who they are. And I know this is something that Stacey absolutely loves when it comes to this part of it. So it'll be good to hear the discussion here. You know, these indigenous people, what was their place in the land of the covenant? And even beforehand, we're going to find out with this. Deuteronomy and Numbers is so linked into this, and there's several different types of Nephilim, and all of them, even back to going back, they have a place. And so I don't want to confuse it. Gary will be able to give a great chronology as to how they fall in with Numbers and Deuteronomy, underlying actually their root and post-diluvianly where they come from and how it relates to the Nephilim. Then you've got chapter 24, Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's based on the text of Jude chapter 1 verse 6. You know, that's connecting the sexual perversion of Sodom with sexual perversion of angels. And we know that the Nephilim were in the Sodom region at that time. So it gives you so many unanswered questions. You just take things when you read it sometimes the way that it is presented in your church, and it's not explained any further. And this chapter actually gives a lot of context and background to things that you've just accepted as verbatim and never questioned until now, or it gives you far more understanding of things that you set aside before. You know, it's probably my favorite chapter here. There are so many different things where Gary is basically saying there is nothing that you can come away from saying that the Nephilims were not the root of everything and the sin in Sodom. And I think that's absolutely quite profound to come into. So I want to give him the opportunity to go really dig into this chapter and do it justice. Excellent points that he draws out about Noah as well and the mortal giants surviving and the remnants of giants and where they're located to. It's absolutely fascinating. Chapter 25 is the Amalekites, and that's based on the first Samuel and people identified as the Amalekites who lived in Shir, ancient times. There's a reference to what this ancient times means, which basically is before the flood. Ancient times are not referring to Abraham. The term ancient is referring to old former times, long ago, before our time, before we understood it, pre-flood epoch. And that's where it's really interesting. And then he draws with underscoring from the book of Sirach, Barak, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Proverbs, Ezra, so many of these ancient paths and ways he's referring to and bringing them into the existence of giants and showing how they fall into the epoch of the antediluvian Nephilim. You know, it gives more of an understanding of the Amalekites, the race of giants that descended from Gilgamesh, questioning where they descended from, proving where they have actually come, the first strain of giants, you know, and this hidden race, and all the catastrophes are sort of given a credence and a body to the framework. So it's very, very exciting to see everything that he's got here. You know, I've tried to do it justice. Obviously, Gary has had this book. He's been studying it, Stacey, for so long that he can understand it. He's got it within him. And when you try to bring it out, break it down for the audience, it's the parts that resonate with you. So I hope that I've done a good job in presenting it to you. It is really exciting, actually. So much detail, more than we can take in. It's one of those books that you constantly are marking, and you've got to reread it. It's too hard for me to just read it without marking and making note. But Stacey, I'd like to hand over to you so that you can bring Gary on for us.
Absolutely, Jess. You've done a fantastic job breaking that down. So that's a lot of good pre-information, but it's always great to have Gary on here, somebody that can recall like he can recall. It's not just one book he has, but he has many books, I believe over 30 books that he's written. So Gary has extensive knowledge in multiple things, multiple chapters of the Bible. and as well as the things that happen as a result from those giants, like the different things from Enoch and all the different things with the Masons and the Temple Society, all these different things. Gary can go in any direction, and that's why I love having him on here, being able to listen to what he has to say. So without further ado, we want to bring Gary on so he can expound to us and the audience on Gen 6, the conspiracy. Welcome, Gary.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm not so sure I can improve on it. I hate to sully what has been done already because it was such a wonderful introduction. But happy to be back, and we're going to talk about as much as we can in those topic areas today. They're large topics, so should be interesting, should be a nice ride. And one of the things that Genesis 6 conspiracy is kind of wrestling in terms of the narrative, it's kind of part of the whole narrative, is this concept about giants both before and after the flood. And how does that come about? And the volume of information that's out there that talks about various ways as to how they either survive the flood or they're recreated after the flood or both. And so in this book, I don't really tend to take a strong position as to which one, because there's that much information. And even in my own sort of understanding, I mean, I'm more comfortable with second incursion, but I can't ignore all the other evidence that would suggest that there was both. And we're going to talk about some things as we get into it today. And we're going to talk about, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it has second incursion and it has survival, actually has both. And that's not uncommon in polytheism. So it's one of those interesting topics and narratives that runs through the whole book, and it's there. And that's, I don't necessarily resolve the whole issue as to which one, but that's not really important. It's just that we want to understand the veracity of giants before and after the flood. And book 2 will get more into my personal side on how, which one I favor more, which is second incursion. So actually, in the last show, we didn't get to chapter 20 of the Seven Sages. It was,
Wow.
it's a little bit larger of a subject. So I thought maybe I'd just do a quick preface on that, because it is really the chapter that starts the transition for giant survival and reoccurring after the flood, and makes a connection back to the gods that are associated with this, and that the gods seem to be changing with that transition as well, from parent gods to offspring gods, as it's talked about in the Seven Sages of Atlantis. And in the last show, we talked about the importance of the Atlantis story and its worldwide implications and mythos that's with us. And so these are essentially Seven Sages. As I sort of did the first research on it, was who are these seven sages that are somehow connected to Atlantis? So you have, like with Quetzalcoatl, for example, starting civilization and teaching civilization on a restart in the Popol Vuh after the flood, who comes from an island continent. And then you realize, well, there's 7 of these sages, but you also start to understand that there are 2 different levels of the sages. There are the gods who are teaching, and then it's the priesthood. And they were typically demigods before the flood, but they're also associated with these orders of these gods both before and after the flood. So you have to make a little bit of a distinction as you're going through some of the ancient history. So when we look at the story of the Egyptians, you have Osiris is the one who's one of these 7 sages. Now, as a god, an offspring god, as what Quetzalcoatl is, versus the parent god in Egypt, which would have been, the chief god like Jeb or Amun or Ra, depending on which one you want to place as in that parent god. It's probably the same god, just different names. And But this is an offspring god, just as his wife. I won't say the name in case we get her name in case we get taken down, but people can understand, who the consort of Osiris is, who produced Horus as the offspring. And so this again is this common sort of legacy of these different types of watchers that are moving up to seemingly replace the parent gods who have mysteriously disappeared. I think they've gone to the pit prison, and as the host, and then an army, these would move up as the first sort of offspring of, as they have their mythos of these gods. I don't think they produced angels. I think these are just ones that moved up in ranks. So, but there's different names to these groups. And you have in Egypt, they're called the Shebtiu. And there are 7 of these, and some versions 8. And so I would put Satan atop of that when you get to the 8th. It's kind of like the 7 gods that are in the days of the week, or the 7 wandering stars. You don't have Satan really included in it. He would be that 8th one that would sit above, as I look at the 8 divine beings, as the Egyptians talk about. And they were called Urshu and Neter gods in Egypt as these watcher gods. There was a definition as watcher. And in Sumer, we get like the Oannes, reptilian fish gods that are starting civilization after the flood, coming from the sea. Could be an allegory. Some people say it should be translated as reptilian versus fish, but reptiles can be in water too, so it doesn't really matter. And it would fit a little bit better, with kind of like the seraphim watchers. These were the Sabeti, the 7 Sabeti. And again, started a priest order by the same name, just as the Shebtiu started an order of the same. And you would also know in Egypt, Shem, Shu, Hor, as that same group of companions of Horus, is those 7 sages of that priest group. And of course, the parent gods were the builder gods from before, but these are different. They're not the builder gods. They're like a regeneration sort of set of gods. They're understood in India as the 7 sages, as you were talking about, and as we'll get into with a little bit on Manu, and 7 sages of Yima. And understood as Manu as being this major sort of priest, king, or sage, or both, because they're priest kings, I think, as they're being depicted in the Vedas. That would be akin to the Persian version of Zoroaster.
Right.
So you have an Avestan version of Indo-Aryan and Sanskrit, and they have very similar gods and names, but there's a couple smaller sort of variations. In Zoroaster and Manu, they're kind of like the Eastern versions of Hermes Trismegistus that we covered in past ones, where you have one that's before the flood, one that shows up after the flood, and a specific god. And in some cases with Hermes, you have a third one that is downstream and more associated with alchemy, but still there's 2 different versions of the Trismegistus, but you still arrive at 3. And so Zoroaster seems to be an individual after the flood. Some people say that that's Ham in the polytheist accounts as Chem or Ham, Zarathustra, as the title was for him, and he takes up magic. And you get that from the writings of Clement from a biblical perspective, according and commenting on what Peter was talking about in the scriptures. I'm not sure how he gets there, but he throws sort of a church father account to the same sort of connection on that. So you have this constant of this crossover of this knowledge, the crossover of the 7 sage order of gods and of priests that are surviving, just as Manu is on the ark, right? So it is a constant that's out there for the polytheist version of how knowledge arrives to the post-diluvian peoples, the giants who survive and the humans, and how that connects in with the polytheist account for the Noahites, the survivors on the ark and their descendants, is Hermes finds the knowledge, or the two pillars, to get the knowledge, and takes it back to Nimrod, and also takes the knowledge of the religion back to Nimrod. So again, in polytheism, they have this constant sort of accounting for how things sort of happen after the flood. And it's important to understand that there are these accounts all around the world. And what's interesting in Roll's Lost Testament, he talks about before the flood and these seven sages, and he actually has Enoch as Oannes, and the one who originally leads the giants down from the mountains. I'm not sure how he gets there all of the time in some of his research. But again, you start to see Enoch, son of Cain, as being this individual before the flood who was involved with the mystical religions, creating the mystical religions, and that knowledge that he creates marriages with the gods. And then we get this nexus point in terms of how it crosses the flood. So I just thought I'd lay that down for a little bit of premise as to how we get to giants after the flood and how civilization starts. So I thought I'd let you back in with that premise on the seven sages.
He said just a little bit. He said a mouthful, and a lot of that information that Gary just laid out, people are wondering, what does that have to do with us now? But those seven sages that he talked about from India area, where you have Vishnu, Brahma, Ganesh, Dharo, Shiva, Kali, although that's where the evil eye comes from. And as we're here today, in this day and age, it's a resurgence of that evil eye, Gary. I don't know if you've seen that around, but a lot of the youngsters are wearing this thing now as though it's something good, the evil eye that comes from that. And then he mentioned Quetzalcoatl, which is Americu, and that's what America is named after, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. So a lot of that has to do with what we're doing in this day and age now.
Yeah, and that all-seeing eye is something that originates from the Western history in Persia, just as it originates in the Indus Valley, because those are the two different settlements of the Aboriginal Indo-Aryans, or giants as we would know them biblically, where they settled, the Avesta and the Sanskrit. And that's why you also have so many gods after the flood that are used in the treaties in the ancient times that are subcontinent of India gods, like Vishnu, for example, or Indra, and they're used in names as witnesses on some of the treaties, even with the Hittites downstream. So there is that sort of interconnection. And again, what it tells us is there's that common history, right? And so when we're looking at those commonalities and those threads, it helps us to understand a little bit more of the story. And so all of this now plays out with Gilgamesh as the most famous flood story that's out there, next to the Noah story. And what's very interesting is that most seculars, I think we've talked about this probably several times, secular is not secular, it's polytheist. They're just sort of the puppets for the polytheists, and which is why God isn't permitted into anything in terms of what's so-called objective in science, right? So Gilgamesh is the story that the seculars and the polytheists like to say is what the Israelites forged and counterfeited the Noah story from. And then they'll go and they will say that the story from the Epic of Gilgamesh is, even though you've got ones even earlier, but they're smaller fragments, the 12 sort of tablets that it comes from, that most people would be more familiar with the more complete story, is dated about 2150 BC, and in around the time of Gilgamesh, right? And his father, and Lugabanda. And so they say because it's older, the Noah story in Genesis is just a counterfeit. And a lot of people go say, well, geez, how do I counter that sort of argument? We ought not to be afraid of older records on parallel events.
Mhm.
There's a nuance, that's a difference, that big differences that are going to come within the stories that we can talk about, and I will. But we should know, because it's fact, that the Torah comes down to Moses in around 1400 BC to 1450 to 1500 or 1200, wherever you want to place that dating. I'm more 14 to 1500, but and using biblical chronology for that. So, of course, those records are older. Doesn't mean they're not talking about the same events. Doesn't mean, though, they're talking about the same people.
Mhm.
So when we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, we should look at that as either a counterfeit of the real flood story or a parallel polytheist account of giant survival story and second incursion. And it's important to look at it that way, because it helps us to better understand things. So if we understand Moses doesn't receive the Torah till after that dating, but we all agree that there's a flood story, then what's in the details of the Epic of Gilgamesh that suggests that these are two different narratives of different people, but of the same cataclysmic event? So what's interesting about Gilgamesh is he is, in the account, he's the son of Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh is 6th generation after the flood. And his mother is Nin, and Nin's son in some of the other translations, who is a fertility bull goddess. And she produces this Gilgamesh individual. Well, that's a second incursion after the flood. And Jessica referred to the Book of Giants, where Gilgamesh's name is there clearly before the flood.
Mhm.
So when we understand what's going on, and we understand there's giants both before and after the flood, and there's a distinct possibility that giants survived the flood, we also have to remember that giants after the flood that were born were often named after giants before. It is quite common for that to happen. Even biblically, we're going to see that. So let's say you have Telmai, for example, that is in the 3 kings of the Anak in the time of the Exodus. Downstream, with the Gesherim giants in Mount Hermon, you're going to have a King Telmai who's married to Makkah, who's going to provide a daughter to Absalom. I mean, to provide a wife to David, who is going to produce Absalom. Different rabbit hole, but understand he's got a patronymic title or a name of a giant. So it's not uncommon. We shouldn't look at that as necessarily a conflict. We should look at that as Gilgamesh likely inheriting the full mythos of the giant before, which is not uncommon as well, and which is common with what happens with like Zeus inheriting the mythos of Kronos, or Baal inheriting the mythos and history and authority of El. That's common in polytheism. So just because we have 2 different accounts of Gilgamesh doesn't make those accounts in polytheism inaccurate or discredit one version over the other. It's quite possible there's 2 based on those descriptions. But what's interesting about Gilgamesh is that he is classified as 2/3 God and 1/3 human. We need to know that that's a little different than descriptions of demigods, which are typically understood as 50% and 50% God. Now, does that give him a higher level, or is demigod not totally understood as 50-50 in terms of that relationship. And were they more God than human? Well, certainly they would like to look at themselves as more God than human, but unless you can show something else being involved, it should be probably 50-50. Nonetheless, they're described as 2/3 God, 1/3 human. So is Enkidu, who's also created after the flood to offset the evilness of Gilgamesh. And so this is this is a story where we get more information amongst the tablets that's included in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood story comes in. And Gilgamesh is actually going to be trying to search out the so-called Sumerian Noah to get wisdom and try and figure out how he can have everlasting life. Because again, life has been taken away from in a mortality perspective for post-diluvian giants. That was removed in Genesis 6:3. And so he's going to search out, and you're going to get a few different names for this individual, and who's the main proponent for survivor of the flood. You're going to get Zayazudra, and then you're going to get the tongue twister. Utnapishtim or Nupishistan, as other pronounce it. I've heard it like 15 different ways, and I never hear it the same twice. So don't worry, Jessica, on how to pronounce that. I think everybody butchers the name, and everybody's guessing on some of these ones. So he is 2/3 God and 1/3 human as well, and he is the prototypical Nephilim. He's the archetype. He is the one that the gods choose to start the Nephilim race or carry the Nephilim race on the other side of the flood. And he takes all of his family with him, who are also giants, 2/3 God, 1/3 human. And there's more involved there than with the 8 that are on the ark. There are different and at the macro level, the story is identical, but on the micro level, the details are different. We do not get Noah described as a giant. He's not created from the offspring of the gods. He is not a king. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. The length of the flood time is different. 7 days, 7 days to build the ark. It's the gods who build the ark for Zayazudra. Notice how he took the easier name there. And it's Noah who builds the ark in the flood story. And it takes him about 100 years to do that from the start of his commission. Once you do the math, not 120 years like people like to say, because God doesn't make math errors. So if you do the math from the birth and the commission to the time going on the flood, it's 100 years, not 120. So the details are different. So I look at this as a parallel account from polytheism in terms of how they are accounting for how giants and humans might survive the flood. And so we should look at it that way. We should not be afraid that there are polytheist accounts around the world. Now, I'm going to add more detail to this, but I think Gilgamesh is such a large topic. I should probably let you in before we move on to the next chapter of other types of flood stories that tell us the 2 different kinds of accounts, human accounts and giant accounts.
Go ahead. I'm ready, Gary. I'm ready to go. Jessica, do you have anything?
Well, I thought that you wanted to talk a little bit more about Gilgamesh was all. So,
well, I was just going to ask about Gilgamesh and Nimrod. How does that line up? Because most people, in the biblical world, believe that's the same person. Gilgamesh is Nimrod. So where do you fall on that?
Yeah, and it's a very good point. So if you look at depictions, you're going to see Gilgamesh depictions interchanged with Nimrod, and that they're basically sort of saying that they're the same individual. So a fellow by the name of Smith is kind of the one who first sort of linked them together. And I cover that in book 1, and then I get into it in more detail into book 2.
Okay.
And so what he's doing, he's translating directly from the Sumerian text, and the individual that he is referring to is Idzubar.
Mm-hmm.
And Idzubar is exactly the same story as the Gilgamesh story. And so he's saying Idzubar, Nimrod, and Gilgamesh are the same. No, Idzubar and Gilgamesh are the same because it's the exact same story, just a different name.
Mm-hmm.
But Nimrod is 3rd generation, not 6th generation, as both accounts of Idzubar and Gilgamesh will attest to. So there's a difference there. And people will say, well, how do you get there? Well, you have to go through the genealogies of the kings to get there. And you're going to, and from a secular perspective, Gilgamesh is going to be about 2600 BC. From a biblical perspective, 2100 to 2200 BC, because of the 600 years difference. And that Nimrod is more likely in the Sumerian text, and Murakar, who is 3rd generation, who also builds a Babel-like tower. I get to him in the towards the end of book 1. And so when we look at Gilgamesh, he is probably an offspring of a watcher that would be not seraphim because of his description, but more cherubim. So a cherubim has the face of a bird and a human, as we see depictions with the Anunnaki. And what I'm basically saying with that, Anunnaki depictions are basically cherubim watchers. And they also have a face of a bull and a face of a lion. So they would take one face of the 4, and they could select whichever one they wanted, and when they took a physical form. So if you're looking at Gilgamesh, well, he has the exact same description in terms of that long black hair, that black curly beard, as what those Anunnaki look like on those reliefs. And so I think he's a little bit different. Now, Gilgamesh, he's son of Cush, right? So he is human. He becomes like a giant, and does battles with giants, and then converts over to them to live amongst and partake in that civilization. And Ham and Hamites are typically described as black-haired. Cush particularly as black-skinned, but also black hair. And so I think there's a correlation there between Nimrod having a similar look in terms of the hair color, but Gilgamesh is pale white skinned. He's not black skinned. So there's a distinction there as well. And we don't know exactly the skin color of Nimrod being from Cush, but we probably know his hair color as being black. So there's a good possibility that there's more of a distinction there, not just the generations, but a little bit different on how they looked. And the Sumerian humans were blackheads, right? So, I mean, it sort of makes consistency sort of sense there. So what Smith has done, he has conflated that, making Idzubar Nimrod, and then conflates them with Gilgamesh. And I think that's a mistake. I think there's too far of distance between the two. And we have a Nimrod-like character already described in Sumerian texts that would be 3rd generation as what Nimrod is, who did the same things that Nimrod did. So I think that's something that I hopefully will be more of a standard sort of correction. And I've gone through all of his text. When I went through book 2, I wanted to be sure that this was an interesting thought, but not totally not substantial with the record. But certainly Idzubar is Gilgamesh. but not Nimrod. And that would be the distinction there.
So, Gary, you said that Gilgamesh was human, but then he transcended angelically. Can you just explain that?
No,
Is this
Nimrod. Nimrod would be.
Nimrod, not Gilgamesh. So
Yeah.
he
Yes.
was human, and then he went into the. Wow, it's confusing. And then he went into this angelic being. How did that happen? Is this Smith, or this is your own research?
Well, this is what Smith did. I looked at what his research and how he determined Nimrod was Gilgamesh.
Right. Okay. It's just confusing because he's saying he's a human, and then all of a sudden he's angelic. How did that happen? How does he account for that? It's quite fascinating.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Well. Yeah, it is. Well, but they also rely on this term that's used that Nimrod became a mighty one. Halal or Kalal. Sorry. I get the visual of the spelling, and then sometimes I do because you can have CH as an H sound as well, like in Horim and other words like that. So if Stephen was here, he'd give me a wrist slap on that one, pretty sure. But Kal-El, like in Superman. So that's how I should remember it. So he becomes a mighty one. And so something changes. He, could be physical. Certainly he was a mighty warrior and a mighty hunter. Could be the rituals and the technology that he's been presented according to the polytheists that change it. The book of Yashir says he wore the clothing of Adam that he managed to steal to get that strength. But whatever way, he has a strut like a giant. I just think he's giant-like. And Gabor, for mighty and mighty one, Gibborim, it can describe people other than a giant, right? It can be somebody who's just strong, somebody who's noble. There's different meanings and translations for that word in the Old Testament. And because we know the father, unless the mother was a female, like in the Gilgamesh case, which is, again, Smith makes that sort of connection as well, then he was fully human who became a demigod through the knowledge, or it was an angelic female mother that's not mentioned. But because we don't have that in Scripture, the mother's name, it's kind of hard to make that case. And we don't have an account of Cush marrying a giant. I mean, or a angel as well. Just as Nimrod, we don't get who his wife is as well. So there's something that's changing about them, but I would not go there as a giant because biblically we just can't quite get there. We're close, but we can't get there because it's the details of the parents are a little bit unique. But again, Smith notes that Lugalbanda was the king of Uruk, and then there was this female goddess that produces Gilgamesh, right? So you can see how those connections get there, but you just can't eliminate the number of generations. That's the issue.
Okay. Well, before you go on to the next chapter or the next level, Sherry Papin, who she works with you and Zen Garcia, she's got a question here. Didn't Nimrod worship Yahuwah at first, but later wanted to know the depth of Hades and also the heights of the heavens? Did that possibly have something to do with this?
Yeah, because he changes his belief system, right? And when you look at the word halal, it's like he breaks his bond, he breaks his word, he does things through sexual rituals that changes him. There's a whole bunch of things going on there. So yeah, do I think that one of the first offspring after the flood was originally brought up to worship God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit? Absolutely. And I put Jesus in with Jehovah of the Elohim there. So yeah, do I think Jehovah, El Elyon, and the Spirit are being worshipped? I think so, initially, because Noah was, and the sons, they were pure in spirit, pure in genealogy. So I think for sure they would have brought up their offspring accordingly. But we know what happens with humans. right? As you know, power and ambition corrupt, and I think that's what happens with Nimrod. So yes, he does move over to the Ahura Mazda god, or the Zoroastrian god of the giants, of the Olamine giants, of the Cadmonine giants, that are all sort of in that area that he's going to create hybrid bloodline dynasty with after Babel, and he stays in that Sumerian area. But yeah, there is that change. But originally, yeah, I think for sure. I mean, it would have just been brought up that way, but at some point in time, he changes. There's different legends and things that sort of lead to that, with the three leader rivals that ends up having a war in the Jewish legends, which Nimrod wins and then takes over to become the tyrant. But again, we don't get that biblically, so it's hard to say that with any sort of veracity. But there's definitely a beginning where he's monotheist, and then he moves over to polytheism. And that gets marked, I think, with the building of Babel City, Babel Tower, and not doing what God instructed to go out and populate the world. They defied God to stay in one location and build Babel City and Tower.
It could also be a DNA change, correct? That happened. I mean, we don't get that in a DNA, something in his DNA.
Oh, DNA change. Yeah. I mean, there could have been, if they had angelic technology, there could be some manipulation going on there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. You can move on. Whatever what chapter are we on? 20.
Yeah. We are on chapter 22, Deucallion, Manu, and Seth.
Right.
And Deucallion is the one I'll start with because it has such a direct parallel to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and being Greek, it's closer to our culture in the West. So Deucallion has a wife named Pyrrha. And Deucallion, as Pyrrha, they're offspring not of humans, they're offspring of gods. So Deucallion is the son of Prometheus. And Prometheus is a god of the offspring gods. Of the offspring gods. And he is one who is said to be, Deucallion is the one that's said to be the Greek Noah, and he survives on an ark as well. So you have a similar story. But again, once you introduce being the offspring of the gods, we're talking about giant survival story. We are not talking about the human survival story. And we do get human survival stories all around the world, on arks, on logs, on walking to the tops of mountains, all sorts of various ways that are separate accounts on arks, in this case, to isolate it back to the arks for humans, that are then of the giants. So what we should take away from this is there is a giant record out there of surviving on an ark, whether it's counterfeit or it's a parallel story. And again, look at it in the same manner as with the details as to what they're talking about and how it is different than the Genesis story, and that we should not be concerned about those other accounts. It just adds to the veracity of Genesis. We know there's giants. We know giants show up after the flood. We know there's an ark with Noah. We're just not told how giants survive the flood in the book of Genesis, or are they recreated? Which is why the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has both, which is so intriguing, right? And in the Greek versions, when you get into Hesiod, and he's talking about the accounts of the giants, there are the first race of giants that are destroyed in the great wars before the flood. And it's akin and parallel to what's talking about in the Atlantis stories with Plato's accounts in Critias and Timaeus of these great wars of these evil beings. But they're all wiped out in those wars before the flood. And then there's another race that started after the flood. And then you overlay, now we also have a Deucallion account. Now you have both second incursion and an arc story for giants as well, coming out of the Greek history. Now, I don't cover the Hesiod accounts in book 1. I do in book 2, because I'm getting more specific into how they and what are the most likely ways of them surviving or showing up after the flood. So when we look at that account, then we should not be surprised when we get into the Manu account, that we have Manu and the seven sages that are on this boat. Now, are the seven sages the gods, or are they the priests of those seven gods? I don't think the gods need an ark. I think these are the priests, but they could be demigod giants, just as Manu is a demigod giant, right? Because the orders were originally started with the nobility elite and offspring of the giants for these special high-level orders, and they've controlled the priesthood ever since. So after the flood, the nobility, the Aryans, and Aryan means the noble ones, the upper two classes, they would control those polytheist religions with bloodline accounts. So in the subcontinent of India, you have the Brahmin priests, which is a bloodline of priests. Bloodline of priests is common in polytheism, and also you have bloodline priests in the Bible. So again, you have polytheism that is always looking to what I would say counterfeit. And again, the polytheists will say, well, the Levite priest doesn't come along till the time of Moses. But you do have the Melchizedek order. That is a continuation through Noah somehow, some way, because he shows up after the flood, even though I think that order is led by the sort of flesh Jesus, because Melchizedek doesn't have a genealogy in the book of Hebrews. But I think there's still that order that is still part of the Noah survivors, is sort of where I'm going with that. So when we look at the Veda accounts, we just have different names of gods for the same gods that are in the pantheons all around the world. We get the same flood story. We get the same seven sages. We get the restart after the flood, and we can interconnect that with Western history, with the Indo-Aryans settling into the Indus Valley after the flood and beginning the Sanskrit version versus the Avestan version that's in Persia for the Indo-Aryans. And again, they don't show how those giants survive that flood. They just have them sort of settling there. So what it does is just bring that volume of accounts up for giant survival story on an arc, because all of these sages are giants, and Manu is a specific king and priest as well. He's a bit of both. He would be more classified as a priest king. So we have the same sort of story in terms of how they survived the flood. And then I introduce another character called Seth, Amaka Seth, as he's understood. And this is a Gnostic account. And Amaka Seth is created by the gods and in a cloud. So a little bit differently than how Gnostics describe the accounts of the giants in Genesis 6. So it's a different sort of classification of giants. And this Amaka Seth individual and the giants that he is spawning, this great superior race, is going to be spawned before the flood at Gomorrah. And then Amaka Seth is saved from the flood, again in a cloud, off the earth in this case. And then Amaka Seth is going to have his seed restarted at Sodom after the flood. So it's interesting that you have a Gnostic account that is looking at um, an epicenter for giants restarting in a second incursion, but also with Seth, you pretty much have a survival story as well, which is kind of perfectly consistent with the other polytheist accounts. Not perfect, but similar in its accounting. And this is the same race that is destined to take over the world in polytheism. These are the descendants of those giants, the spark of the divine that we'll get into in the end time. So I wanted to end section 2 on Gilgamesh and these accounts of what polytheism is talking about in terms of how giants survived the flood, who the offspring gods are, and how that starts to help us understand post-diluvian events, which section 3 begins. And it lays the foundation for a lot of the information we get biblically. And that what it does do, and what it also does is give us a better understanding of what's happening in the Old Testament and where these people start to come from. So it's kind of getting to that point to start working with giants, how they show up after the flood from a biblical perspective, which I cover off in section 3.
So Gary, when you mentioned Melchizedek or Melchizedek, you triggered my memory. So just like Melchizedek, which is in Hebrew, Melchizedek, meaning prince and king, that was a title and not a person. That's why it says it has no beginning and end. And if you go to the book of Yasher, 16:11, it says that Melchizedek, who is Melchizedek, was king of Jerusalem. The same was Shem. So Shem held that title at that time. And that's what I believe, that Nimrod is a title and Gilgamesh was his real name. Like you said, there were many different Gilgameshes. And at that time, that Gilgamesh was the title Nimrod. That's what I believe. So
yeah, and there's definite accounts, and I cover off in the book the accounts of sources that would say that Melchizedek would be Shem, and I think he might be leading, the priest order at that time. I'm not necessarily thinking that he's the one who blessed Abraham, and Shem has a genealogy. So that doesn't quite fit with the description in Hebrews, but it doesn't mean that there isn't that order and that it's perfect. I look at it as it's to me, it's more scripturally perfect to have Jehovah of the Elohim as the head of the Melchizedek order, who's going to take that over in the end time.
Right.
And he's the one who's going to bless Abraham, who's going to bring about Israel so that he can come about to be made flesh, right? To complete that cycle.
So let me read it to you real quick. Jasher 16:11, it says, and Adoni-Zedek, which is Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, went out with his men to meet Abraham and his people with bread and wine. And they remained together in the valley of Malek. And Sadiq blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave him a tenth from all that he had brought from the spoils of his enemies to Melchizedek. So that's what you're talking about, was that blessing. That's why I believe that was a title that Shem held at that time. And this is what Shaul. This is what Shaul, who they call Paul, was talking about when he says we're no longer under the Levitical priesthood, but now we're under a brotherhood priesthood, which is Melchizedek, which Yahusha now holds that title. So
when you're with Adoni-Zedek, Zedek, this is different than Melchizedek, has a different name and title. And Adoni-Zedek, as he's recorded biblically, is a giant king. I cover him off in book 2. So I recognize what Yasher says. I don't recognize that as a source because that's just in book 1, and I don't use book Yasher in book 1. I kind of use other sources that have the same things in the book of Jasher to get there, because I'm more interested in having from those accounts the polytheists speak in their own words on how they get there. And so the polytheists, like the Gnostics, absolutely believe Shem was Melchizedek. But scripturally, we don't get that. So, and I'm not saying it's, he may not have been part of the order. All I know is I don't have the scripture for that. So I leave that more open. And then I match up what is talked about in book of Hebrews. And I'm looking at, that seems to be talking about some being a little bit greater than the son of Noah. So, but it's good to agree to disagree on this, because it's not definite. It's not definite. I'm just saying my point, how I get there in terms of my understanding.
Right.
Because
this is something that
we don't
evolves,
have a smoking gun. That's
correct.
So it's,
just before you go on,
so it's important.
Sorry, Gary.
And it's why I cover all. And it's why I cover all of those different accounts in book 1, because there's so many different versions of it. In terms of the story of Melchizedek.
I was just going to say, Sue Squibb, I brought her comment up rather than a question. Some giants may have survived Atlanta. Maybe this is where they fled, or at least that's what she's saying in this sentence. Just in context of what you were presenting throughout.
Yeah, and earlier on in the book, I have an account of the Snake Clan that I sort of weave through that escaped from Atlantis. And the Hopi have the best accounting of Atlantean Snake Clan from an island in the Atlantic who starts their civilization. That's the most direct one. And I would also look at the Popol Vuh has accountings coming from the island that Quetzalcoatl is going to provide the knowledge for these survivors from this island, which are the Kushamaya, right, as they show up in the Popol Vuh. So I think giants, and with this serpentine look that Atlanteans were described as I cover off earlier in the book, sort of fit into that quite well. And that from a survival perspective, both before the flood and after the flood, most of the kings are described in artifacts as serpentine. They have a serpentine look. So all of that sort of fits in. And so whether or not we have multiple civilizations that have survivors, or one civilization that everyone is referring to, polytheists would say multiple survivors from multiple civilizations. We don't know, but what we do have is the biblical account of the humans surviving, and a question mark: is it survival of giants, or is it second incursion? So, and again, that's where all the speculation starts to come in. So again, I'm open to giants surviving, and I get there biblically, just so people know why I leave that crack open, even though I'm more of a second incursion guy. Is that in Genesis 6 and Genesis 7, in the flood story accounts, God says he is going to destroy everything he created on the earth. He did not create the giants. The fallen angels did. So if you want to have sort of a legal position in terms of how giants might survive, somehow God, through the free will of the fallen angels, permitted that to happen. And then he knew that he would let them survive somehow, some way, on an ark, in the earth, off the earth. However it's done, he knew that they were going to try and either help them to survive, recreate them again, because he's Alpha Omega, and or both. And that giants were going to be plaguing us as the terrible ones and the branch of the terrible ones all throughout our history.
Very true. And Gary, without diverting you, what about the Nephilim today? Where do you see that with all your research, your study, your worship, in your own spirituality and life biblically? What would you say for the Nephilim, the fallen ones today in our time?
Well, we know their descendants are here.
Mm-hmm.
At least those who say they are descendants and have genealogies that go back into prehistory. Those are the royals. Those are the top two classes, the nobility, the Indo-Aryan descendants. And they try and keep those bloodlines as pure as possible because that's where they're going to fit into that hierarchy, and or ennobling with other specific fallen angel bloodline and original patriarch or matriarch from a giant creation of a tribe story or a nation. So we certainly have that. Are there giants that have survived still with us today? Perhaps, but not sort of walking amongst us. They might be hidden in remote locations. They may be hidden and protected under the sea. They might be in the earth. They might be in stasis. All of that is might, because I don't have anything that I can really say with any sort of evidence that they're here today, although that was an interesting story that I listened to, and the details are extraordinary, with Steve Quayle and the Afghanistan giant account on Coast to Coast with the helicopter pilot who was there, who was giving the accounts. I mean, it was just astonishing. But we're accepting a version of it, and we don't have anything to corroborate it. So again, I'm open to ancient giants still surviving, or their descendants still surviving as giants, but it would have to be done with help, because how would we not notice them in this day and age?
Yes.
They would have to be being hidden or protected by ones who want to do that, who would have an interest, which would probably be the nobility elite, or the Elim, as I like to call them.
Yeah, or through Hitler's Ubermen that are a DNA change, and they can be our size and advance to giant size when they want to. Always a possibility, right?
Always that changeling possibility. I mean,
Yeah.
again, no proof for that,
Right,
but
right.
it's a possibility, at least from coming out of the occult belief system, where they have so many shapeshifters, including the elementals that who are smaller beings that have shapeshifting capability as well. So
yes, sir.
We had a guest, I think I said this to you previously, from the Cook Islands, Chosen Few, Joe, friend of ours. He's based in New Zealand, and he talks about within his line, so maybe his grandmother and so on, they have seen on islands within New Zealand still taller type giant beings that are just left there. But also in our lifetime, he has friends who had to go and move from one place, graves and other things, not necessarily graves, showing the existence of giants, and moving it somewhere else. So, again, there's so much that you need to have corroborated, but this is just experiences of people that that say what they were hired for or what they have seen. So it's like what you said, it corroborates to that extent what you said, but you just never know. But it's good to have that understanding, really, rather than just being closed on it. It's very, very
and
fascinating.
there's so many of those firsthand accounts that aren't part of the official record and recognized, that you can't say it's all coincidental, because it's just not possible. And giant bones were discovered in places all over the world, and we have an actual record of giant bones being discovered, not actually when they might have lived, and because we haven't seen the carbon datings on them, but they're recorded in newspaper stories from the 1950s back to the 1850s. And I have a link that, if people get a hold of me, I'll send you the link, where it has many of these ones, and on it gives a spreadsheet of the description, the size of the bones, and this and that. And then in one of the boxes in the Excel spreadsheet is the actual link to the newspaper story. So it'll bring it up from whatever year and whatever newspaper, and you can see what they talked about it. And the stories all have a similar end to it. What happens is the bones are discovered. In the first case, They call the university comes out, they excavate it, everybody's talking about it. Then they call the Smithsonian comes in, they take the bones, and then they say those bones don't exist. The second trail is discovery gets made, the university's not called, they go directly to the Smithsonian, the bones get sent to the Smithsonian, and then they disavow that those bones ever existed. So and you can't make this up, because all you have to do is follow a little bit of history from the newspaper story, and you can track these types of stories back that there's an accounting for, because these things just don't disappear completely from the historical record, or with people saying, or follow-up stories in newspapers like, where did these bones go? Why haven't we heard more about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that's the Arizona paper where I live, Gary, that was tied to the Grand Canyon, if I'm not mistaken, where they found that.
Well, and
that was one of them.
there's supposedly just incredible numbers that were found in the Grand Canyon, and many of those areas are blocked off, as you know very well to this day, that you can't get into them, and nobody tells you why.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, very good. Thank you, Gary. You can lead us on to the next chapter.
Yeah, so we're going to start section 3, and that is this, and it's called The Descendants of Anak, and the subtitle is Bloodlines and Covenants. And I wasn't real sure when I was writing the book, like, where do I start in terms of talking about the biblical side of giants, where we get from a biblical understanding, we get Genesis 6, and then just giants showing up in the time of Abraham and the time of the Exodus and afterwards. So where do I start with this? And I just thought, you know what? There is this interesting group of people called the Rephaites that are talked about in the Bible. And within the mythos of giants, Amorites are talked about at great length as being a significant race of giants. And at the time when I first came out and my book was being released, Amorites were thought to be the greatest, numerous, biggest giants ever, and everybody would point to like the book of Amos that said, they were as tall and wide as the cedars of Lebanon, which were giant trees that would grow to 100 feet tall and 50 feet wide, like a 2-to-1 height to width ratio, just like Og's bed would have that, because they're incredibly sort of stocky. So how big were these giants if they're compared to the giant trees? Unfortunately, that's a simile, right? It's not an exact description. So we have to be careful with that. Not saying that they weren't giants. And what I wanted to do is start with these two groups, one that you could definitely link to giants with the Rephaites, and the other ones that are associated with giants. And I wanted to explore them over a few chapters and develop that kind of information. And so the Rephaim, as I like to call them, I don't like to use Rephaite, but again, I was just introducing Rephaites because nobody talked about Rephaites for the most part as giants. It's Nephilim, but we only see in the KJV and other translations the word for Nephilim or giants show up after the flood in Numbers 13:33. And I know Steve translates that a little bit differently, but in the other Bibles, that's how it's translated. They don't show up after the flood. You get giants, but it goes back to Rapha. So, and it's the Anakim that are referenced in Numbers 13:33 as the children of giants. And the Anak or Anakim are described as giants in Deuteronomy 2, and the word isn't Nephilim or Rephaim. I mean, it isn't Nephilim or Nephilim, it's actually Rephaim or Rapha in the singular as giants, just as the Emin giants are Rapha. Just as the Zamzuzim giants are Rapha, the Avanim giants are Rapha, And you have Rapha that's used numerous times throughout the Old Testament, translated as either Rapha or as Rephaim or as giant, mostly giant. So Rephaim actually shows up 2 times in the Old Testament, or Rephaite, depending on which translation you're reading, in Genesis 14 and Genesis 15. Genesis 14 is the War of Giants that I cover off in this section as well. And they're living in the Mount Hermon region, in the Bashan region. And you have the Rephaim that are also listed in Genesis 15 in the lands that God is rewarding Abraham with and promising to his descendants. So you have them as a specific tribe twice, with the actual name being translated. And I thought I would start, with them, and that these were described as giants throughout the Old Testament. So Og is described as the last of the giants. Hebrew word Rapha. So there's something distinct here between the Rephaim and the Nephilim, but I'm not going to get into that distinction, and because that would take book 2 to explain. But I wanted the people to get an understanding that giants were related somehow to the Rephaim, because the other ones that are described as giants are Rapha or Rapha-like.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an association there. And like Og can mean long neck, and Ak can mean long neck. And Og was a Rephaim, and he's the last of the Rephaim. And again, that whole understanding of what does the last of the Rephaim mean, that Og is the survivor, the last survivor of. Does that mean he's the last survivor from the flood? Or does that mean he's the last of the original Rephaim that were created after the flood? Again, I don't resolve that in book 1, but I get at that more in book 2. And so so it feeds into both sort of understandings of how giants show up after the flood. And another tribe that I'm going to introduce but not get into in this chapter are the Amalekim. And I call them Amalekites in book 1, and I get to Amalekim to distinguish giants from hybrid humans and giants and humans. And everybody used to say when I first put my book out is that anything that ends in an "ite" is a giant. I'm going, well, are the Israelites giants? And of course not. And so that's kind of an imperfect sort of suffix to it. But you get these versions of Horim, Avim, Anakim as giants, Rephaim, all with that I am plural. In book 2, actually show some of the research that comes from other languages that I am was a suffix used for the majestic royal bloodline from the gods. Mm-hmm. So it's a perfect sort of title, but I don't get into explaining that. I'm just trying to get giants, and there's a couple kinds of giants that are out there. And so with the Rephaites, these are giants that are the first ones that are mentioned after the flood in the War of Giants in Genesis 14, and then mentioned in the land that Abraham's descendants were going to receive. Mm-hmm. And so that's just sort of, to me, that just lays a foundation of giant interrelationship with Israel and humankind that we need to do. And I also wanted to get into Amorites in terms of their history and how powerful of a nation this was. But Amorites are the descendants and tribe of Canaan. They're not specifically described as a giant race in Genesis 10 or First Chronicles. They just don't have a patriarch.
Mm-hmm.
There's only 9 patriarchs in the Table of Nations that don't have a patriarch, and they're the families of Canaan. There are 12 tribes. Canaan is a tribe. Hittites, Heth is a tribe. Sidon, Sidonian is a tribe. But then you have the Amorites. You have the Jebusites. You have these families. And when you take that back to the Hebrew, it can mean family, but also can mean a different kind or a different species or a different race. And the Amorites are described as these blonde-haired, blue-eyed giants in accounts in all different sections through the Middle East that actually come to power in Babylon. And they were the mortal enemies of so many of the Mesopotamian civilizations at that time. They were despised. And they're a term that is almost used ubiquitously for the Canaanites, just as Canaanite would be used to describe all of the tribes as well. So they become the most powerful tribe of giants, or so-called giants. And where do they fit? Because we can't take them back to like the Anakim that we have a patriarch for, which is Arba in Joshua 14 and 15. He's the greatest of the Anakim, and he's the patriarch of them. And yet Arba doesn't have a listing in the Table of Nations. Rapha is used, as it's understood, as a single giant, as a plural giants, Rephaim, and also as a patriarch whose name was passed on eponymously after a tribe of giants, the Rephaim.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not uncommon. So like Hori, for example, is the singular for Horim, and there is a tribe of Horim giants. That's part of that eponymous sort of name. Arba doesn't pass that on. For some reason, it's Anakim, an Anakite, or an Anak, as it's used in the KJV and the different words that they're using for the same people. But it's that lack of giant not showing up in the Table of Nations. So I look at the Amorites, and I get to a point as I go through multiple chapters with the Amorites that these were taller than humans, that they were giants, but they were somehow less than these other giants. And in fact, King Og was ruler over Amorites in the Bashan region after the fall of the Rephaim tribe in the War of Giants in Genesis 14. Mm-hmm. So there's an association there. And the Amorites also lived amongst the Anakim. And so you have this sort of intermarriage. So I don't get into patriarchless tribes as being hybrid human giants with Rephaim patriarchs that they're named eponymously after in book 1, but I start to separate them, that there's something about these ones, but they're a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And with the Amalekim, I'm introducing the idea that the Amalekites are different than the in Genesis 36 are different than the Amalekites in Genesis 14. And the Amalekim could either be giants that survived the flood or are recreated again after the flood. I lean more in book 1 to surviving and before the flood, based on the descriptions of old and stuff that you had led into the presentation with when we talked about the Amalekim in terms of how they're described. But they're distinct from the Amalekites. The Amalekites come from the addition to the Table of Nations in Genesis 36. I'm going to cover them off in detail in downstream chapters, but just so we don't lose people here, Timnah, a Horim, pure female, marries Eliphaz, son of Esau, and names him Amalek, who is going to create the hybrid human race that is going to move amongst the Amalekim in Petra, where the Amalekim lived. as their capital city. And the Amalekites lived there as well. But that starts to set the stage for these hybrid humans, which the Amorites that I make the case are kind of akin to in terms of being giant-like, just not as tall. So in book 2, I'll get into it in terms of the execration text that will describe these hybrids as the Shazu, and they're about 7 to 9 feet tall, and they lived amongst the giants. So chapter 23 is the introduction of these peoples, and then I start to develop that in a more way as we move into other chapters throughout section 3. So I'll let you guys back in there because, again, I covered a lot of territory.
Yeah. So Job 26, Gary also talks about the Rephaim, and it says that the King James says dead things are formed underwater, but in the Sefer it says the Rephaim are formed under the water and the inhabitants thereof. So I'm thinking, they're more like the larger giants, as you talked about, the soulless ones, obviously. And I just wanted to bring that up and mentions it there.
Yeah, so the dead usually it goes back to 7496. There's 7495 for heal and healer, which is the source word, 7496 for the spirit or the demon spirit, and 7497 is the giant, and they all root back to 7495. So you can call those spirits Rephaim because they're Rephaim spirits. So it makes sense in terms of how that's being translated by Steve. But I just wanted to show the distinctions. And all words, they're interconnected and are describing the same beings. Just one was when they lived in the physical body, and then when they became the disembodied spirit, still the same being.
Yes. Yeah, but I'm not even going to open that can of worms, how they're formed underwater. We'll just keep going by that, Gary.
That is, So I did a show on all of, and that one didn't come up, and I thought, I wonder why, but I think we covered so many other verses about something about the water is part of the realm of the fallen angels and all sorts of things, and we got into on that. I won't cover that off today, but there's how the Bible deals with water and the abyss is absolutely intriguing, and why it's salt water, just like the Dead Sea is basically salt water with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's almost like it's a corrupted place where where the gods live and some of the beings may hang out at.
Yeah, in the world that I deal in deliverance, we call that the Marine Kingdom. That's what they call it. So
yeah.
And
I have no reason to disavow the concept of the Marine Kingdom, and I mean, we have no idea what's going on in the oceans, right? So
absolutely,
yeah, fascinating. We're going to have to cover that at some point. So Sue Squibb here. It's a comment rather than a question. So interesting. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, often described as angelic. That's even going back to Hitler's Aryan race. Something that just came out when you said that. But we actually have a question here also from Frank Lazio. One verse puzzles him. How does the land devour its inhabitants? What does that mean?
Well, that's a little bit allegorical. So, and I think, and what I think the passage is referring to is that this is the land that Israel is going to move into, and that's a land that devours the people, right? So, two things I would say to that in terms of what it's getting at as you get more information downstream in the Bible on is, one is that the land wasn't given to Israel all at once because God said you would be overrun by wild animals and beasts because you're not numerous enough. You have to be numerous enough not to be overrun by those beasts. But in this case, there may be those beasts that are running around, but I think it's referring to the land that the giants are occupying and that they probably eat humans.
Yes.
Yeah. Feed 5 folk come is real.
And yeah, or it could be just, again, that they're so violent, it's going to consume any nation that tries to invade them. But I do think that there is a strong tradition of drinking blood and eating humans with giants that's recorded, all around the world, that one should look at that in that sort of manner, as not only is it a wild, untamed land, but those giants did horrible things.
Yeah. And actually, it's just an observation here, but maybe you can say more to this. Could Bigfoot be related to this? A Nephilim breeding with an animal making this type of creature? Have you looked into not only breeding with humans, but also with animals, and like Bigfoot as a result?
Yeah, I think there's something that's unique about Bigfoot, and it is, I think it has a mythos on all continents all around the world. It's part of that common legacy, both before and after the flood. And it's some sort of intelligent being, and its eyes glow, and it's hairy. So there's a lot of interesting sort of connections to Nephilim and Rephaim, except that it's still a little different, and it's not as big as the giants. And it's also associated in its accounts with the elementals, the little people, all around the world. And it's associated with caves all around the world, and somehow magically sort of disappearing. So this is likely a being that's created by the fallen angels, both before and after the flood, and or survival. But it's distinct. Just like elementals, which are the little ones, and the reptilian salamanders, which are a little taller than humans, are distinct from the giants and lower in the hierarchy. So I don't know whether or not Bigfoot would be lower than the elementals. They seem to work with them, but they're not in charge of the elementals. So I think they might be a little bit lower, but the occult says the elementals are the lowest level of the hierarchy. So maybe they're slightly above, but I just can't make that sort of work in terms of the information that I have yet on them. So are they partially DNA manipulation? Are they caused by giants creating them? It's possible with animals, but what's more likely is it's some sort of angelic creation. And it's interesting that we have like monkey gods and ape gods that are in India and in China that are registered in prehistory. And they, so if they produced, it would just, you would see a being that looked like that. There are also giants that are showed in, not giants, but angels that are shown in the pit prison in a Gnostic gospel in Pistis Sophia. And these are ones that are in prison for the crimes. And you have ones that are described with the face of a bear and the face of an ape. And they have specific names. And these are, and we don't get descriptions of all of the angels.
Right.
We know what a seraphim looks like. We know the four faces of a cherubim. We know the four faces kind of an Ophanim, because who knows what the cherubim face is? Is it all four? One of the four? But we know generally kind of what it looks like. We know the face of an archangel. We know the face of a general messenger angel, but we don't know the face of a dunamis, exousia, Icarus. These are Greek names for angelic beings in the hierarchy in the New Testament and others. We don't get descriptions for them. So if they had a face different than a human, and if they created beings like these bear or monkey or ape ones, they would look kind of like them. Now, is there something else going on? Because again, we have the gods creating the little ones. So why aren't they giants? What did they do to make them smaller? and or they're a little bit different. And then how did they make chimera beings with sentient beings like King Hababa out of the cedar forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or these other creatures that are shown in prehistory? So all of that is either done through the fallen angels or it's done through the giants, but it's all done through giant. To get these chimera type beings, it's got to have some sort of DNA or other influence that's involved. And when I mentioned 2/3 God and 1/3 human,
Yeah.
is that a reference on some giants that they have the ability to, the fallen angels had the ability to somehow do a DNA manipulation of some sort, or some sort of technology to give a higher weight to the level of godhood, and that's how they set up the hierarchy of the giants? I don't know. I don't have any answers for that. I only have questions on some of this. But what I do know is illicit creations tend to be connected all back to the gods.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that the monkey man you're talking about, Gary, that was done at the Tower of Babel. Remember when they turned part of them into monkeys and part of them into elephant men? That's Ganesh in Dero. That's
Yeah, the
worship
book of
in India.
Yashar again. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's worship.
Yep.
That's
Yeah,
their
I look at
worship
that.
in India.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and elephants as well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, elephant
So,
is Ganesh, and the monkey part is Dero.
yep. And if that's the case, then they would be demigods, right?
Mhm.
And then you get back in based on that account. So again, I recognize that.
Mhm.
I don't have that biblically, but I don't have the other stuff biblically either.
Mm.
But we have the MO, and that's
Yes.
what I would look at.
Yeah.
But
It's good to see the
giants
way that
did
you
all
think.
sorts. Yeah,
Sorry,
but
I was just saying
giants
the way you
have.
think and study.
Yeah, I heard that and appreciate that compliment. And giants did the most abominable things
Mhm.
in the
Mm.
land of the covenant. So you can't rule that out either. But again, not for me, not quite definitive enough to get there. But I'm open to how these other creatures are, and maybe someday we'll know. I just don't overreach what I can back up biblically. I'll
Gotcha.
speculate, and I think
Right.
my speculation is on that stuff that probably both are involved because the giants had the technology
Mhm.
Mm.
of the fallen angels.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, that's excellent. That explains a lot. Just you saying that last thing, the giants had the technology of the fallen angels. There's so many rabbit holes and so many things you can go further and delve into. But where do you want to go,
Yeah,
Gary?
and I don't think that, and when I say that, in case somebody says, well, does that mean they could have overthrown the angels? I don't think the fallen angels would be that stupid. I don't think they would give them everything they know. They would still want to be able to control their offspring, right? So, yes, but they would have had great technology. There's no doubt about it, and they would have been doing it. And who knows? Maybe many of the fallen angels decided to have giants do it both before and after the flood, so they wouldn't have that crime on their hands, right? And they
Mm.
wouldn't get sent to the pit prison. But clearly, we have fallen angels that go to the pit prison biblically
Yes.
for these
Mhm.
crimes, and the offspring gods who did the same type of crimes, because in the Ugaritic text, for example, they give the explanation for where the Rephaim come from. It comes
Mhm.
from the Baalim council of gods after the flood, and one of the titles for and names for Baal was also variations of Raphael, like Raphael and Raphael, like just variations as additional titles, where
Mhm.
the first product of the Rephaim was Rapha, that is the eponymous and patriarch, the eponymous name from the patriarch and the god that would start the Rephaim giant line. So you also get, and in book 2, I get there with the connections with the Amorites too, with the Baalim council. There's a god named Amaru, who produced giants named Amor,
Yeah.
and that
Mhm.
is the equivalent spelling transliterated to Amorite for Amorite in the Bible. And I think the God that creates the first patriarch named Amor, and then he creates through human females the hybrid line of the Amorites.
Okay.
So
Very interesting. Okay.
So
you had a question.
I don't know whether we
you had one more question about female angels.
Yeah, good question. So
I wasn't
I was
going
just going to say, and I'm going to answer the question.
All that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to get chapter 24 done today, and Sodom and Gomorrah is one of those topics I don't want to do. I want to do in detail because it's so important. So, yeah, we can answer questions or talk more about the giants. So, female angels, do they exist? Right? And typically, we understand angels as a he, as a male, but that's also a physical construct because you don't reproduce in heaven, so you don't need male and female, right? It's not necessarily a heavenly thing.
Right.
And when fallen angels take a physical form, they can choose a gender in the physical world, and some of them become a female god or a goddess, and we get that biblically too, with goddesses like Anat, the consort of Baal, and other goddesses and Diana is another one from the New Testament that's mentioned. So I give one from each, but there's more. So we know that in the physical form, they can take a female form, but can they take, and is there a female angel? I'm open to the possibility of that. And there is one example in Zechariah 5 where you can look at that, take it back to the Hebrew. And this is where the two women with wings are going to take the woman in the basket, Babylon, and establish her in the end time in Shinar or in Babylon. And when I look at that from a Hebrew perspective, that's a female angel.
Okay.
So there's a possibility, but I don't have more than that. I wish I had, a couple of passages. But is it really important? Probably not, because we don't need, as an immortal, a gender, and we don't need sex to reproduce because we're going to be immortal after the resurrection, which is why there's no marriage in heaven. So we do use the construct of the male for the Word who became flesh, which makes sense because he became flesh in a human body, but that didn't make him necessarily male as we would understand that in heaven. He's a spirit being. And we use the word Father for God, but it's still a title and it's still a construct, right? For our understanding. We don't know what God is. We know he's spirit. We just don't know the magnitude and have an ability to understand what God is. So I won't rule it out. We only have one example. It's a possibility, but it wouldn't have a meaning to our understanding as it does in the physical world for reproduction.
Okay.
I'm in agreement. It's sort of like you name your boat vessel the Lanola Gay. You call it a female. It's not really a female, but you name it that. Similar to that, right, Gary?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean the translation
And
from Hebrew to English. That's how it comes across, and we want to put that term on there.
And I think one of the crimes that the fallen angels do is when they create the mother goddess as a female, and then give that mother goddess the same role as the Holy Spirit. Now that becomes a crime against the Holy Spirit. That's not going to be forgiven.
Right.
So again, we want to be careful with applying a feminine aspect to the Holy Spirit. Even though you have Sophia for wisdom in the New Testament, and you have Chakam or chaka in Proverbs and elsewhere, but you also have chakum, which is the root word for chaka, or the application of the wisdom. And you have to be careful, is it referring to a female or the application of the meaning of the words? So we want to be careful with feminizing the Holy Spirit, and thus we want to be careful with feminizing the angelic realm, but we do have that example. So that's why I say I leave that crack open.
Well, we're in agreement about the Holy Spirit. We don't believe in feminizing it at all, but very interested to know. Well, I don't think we see females as being angelic, but it's questions that arise. So many questions arise when you bring things out. You know, today's been a very good opportunity, Gary, to just be more at home and ask those questions as well. Your teaching is absolutely amazing. We're going to be looking forward to you coming back, which will be on the 1st of September, not the 1st of September, the first Tuesday in September, where we will kick off with Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's sort of now like waiting, isn't it? A cliffhanger until we come back for you to take us into that. And of course, that's going to be so much biblical context, and one that people will have many questions of their own. But when you read that chapter, it's normally been presented as a story, and all of a sudden you see so many things that you just accepted, and now there are many questions and connections that were never considered before. So it'll be good to come back fresh and to hear you present this and go on from there. We've still got so many chapters in your book to go through. We're supposed to be finished in 6 months' time, and we're past that now. You know.
It's a big book.
Before we go, how are you going with book 3? Where are you with that right now?
It's still stalled. I've started a process now to eliminate as many shows as I have been doing. So where I was doing basically a show a day for the last few years, that doesn't allow me any time to do proper research and writing. Yes. So what I've been doing is that I have you guys slated into the end of the year, and I'm booked out to the end of the year. Yeah. But I wanted to make sure that if we were going to be continuing, I had dates set for you guys. I need to have some time to write that book. So I've got 10 chapters written on the first sort of putting the information together. And I want to get back at it because I have not had a chance to do any writing for over a year on it. It's just been that busy. So that's on my agenda. I'm going to try and start getting back to doing more on it. It's going to be a little bit different direction. It does start in the time of giants and Abraham, but I'm focused on this book on the creation of Israel, the Holy Covenant, the blessings and the curses of the covenant, how that plays out with Israel, and how that connects into the end time on a parallel track to the church in their reconciliation and in second Exodus, and how they, are going to be reconciled to be part of the bride for the supper of the Lamb. So it's going to go starting in the time of giants, and I'm going to give some unique biblical history there that resolves some questions that I spent a fair bit of time getting it right. But as it moves forward, it's going to be more about Israel, and it's going to be more about the importance. And I really want to do the justice to the second Exodus passages that are just throughout the Old Testament, and show people that we have to, if we want to understand the end time, we have to understand that parallel track when Israel is called back by name and awakened. And then the breaker comes and breaks them out of prison.
Wow, so much. Thank you, Gary. Wow, fantastic. We really do thank you for joining with us, especially because you are on your summer vacation with everything you've just explained, needing time to do your book and still keeping up with some of your commitments. So thank you so much for that. Please continue to pray for Joy who is recovering at home, and also Carrie Baruch. She's not very well herself, going through different treatments. So please continue to pray for both of them. Stacey, why don't we just pray everyone out together?
Absolutely. Heavenly Father, we come to you this evening once again to give you thanks, praise, honor, and glory. We thank you for the word that went out today. We pray right now that everyone listening to this and everyone that will listen to this will be blessed. Not our words, but thy word will come through and shine forth. Everything that we say fall off, and everything that's coming from the Ruach HaKodesh will go forward and bless everyone here. We thank you for this opportunity to break bread again with our brother Gary. And we thank you for the people that are in the chat. We pray for health and strength and recovery of the health of the people that are ailing right now in the chat. Everyone that's hurting, we pray, that you would fill them with whatever they need. And we are careful to give praise and honor to their only begotten Son, Yahushua Mashiach. In his mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Wonderful. And I said,
Amen.
Carrie Baruch, it's Christelle that is ill. Sorry, Carrie, it's not you, it's Christelle. And Gary, we just stand with you, the work that you're doing, and for the strength that you require. We pray that in this time that you're on your break, you somehow are being able to invigorate with your family, but also move forward with the book and getting this across. So it's absolutely wonderful.
Yes.
Pleasure working with you today.
Yes.
And for our
slowing down,
chat.
Thank you. Slowing down a little bit in doing the amount of interviews. I'm going to average 3 to 4 a week. So it's not like but it will help make sure I stay married. That's for sure.
Oh, your wife is very precious. Oh, thank you. We must thank her also. So look, thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Gary. Thank you to everyone watching live and in the chat, keeping you here. You've been wonderful with your engagement today. Looking forward to see the response during the week, and for those that will be joining in later on video on demand. You take care, and we will see you next Tuesday. You're blessed.
Blessings.